Have you ever caught yourself thinking that a certain coincidence was a sign from the universe? Maybe you saw the same number appear 3 times in one day, or you bumped into an old friend just when you were questioning a big decision, and for a moment it felt like destiny was speaking directly to you. These moments can feel magical, even comforting, as though there's an invisible script guiding your path. But here's the surprising truth. Your brain is the author of that script. It is constantly searching for meaning even when none exists. This is the phenomenon psychologists call apophenia, the tendency to see connections and patterns in random events. It's the same mechanism that makes us see faces in clouds, hear hidden messages in songs, or believe that repeating numbers are cosmic signals. And while it may seem irrational, this trait is deeply human, and it has both pitfalls and potential. In this video, we'll explore why your brain creates stories out of chance, how this can lead you into illusions and self-deception, but also how you can turn the very same mechanism into a tool for creativity, intuition, and personal growth. Let's start with the basics. Why does your brain do this at all? From an evolutionary standpoint, pattern recognition was one of the most important skills for survival. Imagine your distant ancestors walking through tall grass. If they noticed the rustle of leaves and assumed it was just the wind, they might end up as lunch for a predator. But if they assumed the rustle meant danger, even if they were wrong 9 times out of 10, they had a better chance of staying alive. In other words, our brains evolved to err on the side of seeing connections, even false ones, because the cost of missing a real threat was far greater than the cost of a false alarm. This is sometimes called a better safe than sorry bias. Over thousands of years, this tendency became deeply ingrained, and today it shows up in all sorts of unexpected ways. You don't just see a cloud, you see a face in it. You don't just notice 2 events, you weave them into a narrative. But it's not just about survival anymore. Modern life is full of randomness and noise, and your brain is like a meaning-making machine that can't help but try to organize it. The psychologist Klaus Conrad, who first coined the term apophenia, noticed this tendency especially in patients who were beginning to develop psychosis. They would see hidden messages everywhere, patterns in traffic lights, codes in newspapers, signs in strangers' gestures. While that's an extreme version, the underlying process exists in all of us. It's why conspiracy theories are so seductive. The brain finds random details and stitches them together into what feels like a coherent story. And once you've seen that story, it's very hard to unsee it. Now, you might be thinking, if this mechanism can mislead us, isn't it just a flaw in the system? Not necessarily. Like many quirks of the mind, apophenia is double-edged. On one side, it can trap you in superstition, magical thinking, or paranoia, making you believe in forces or patterns that aren't real. On the other side, it fuels creativity and innovation. Think about art, music, or scientific discovery. Many breakthroughs come from seeing unexpected connections between unrelated things. When Darwin developed his theory of evolution, he wasn't just cataloging species, he was connecting dots that no one had connected before. When Einstein imagined riding on a beam of light, he was blending playful imagination with physics. These are examples of apophenia in its most constructive form. The brain's hunger for patterns turned into insight rather than illusion. So the question becomes, how can you recognize when your brain is tricking you with false patterns, and how can you harness this same ability for growth and creativity? To answer that, we need to break down what's happening in your brain. At the simplest level, apophenia is your brain's pattern detection system on overdrive. The visual cortex looks for shapes, the auditory system looks for rhythms, and the prefrontal cortex tries to stitch fragments into a story. Your brain is wired to prefer order over chaos. Even when confronted with randomness, it will generate explanations because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. This is why leaving a coin toss entirely to chance feels unsatisfying. We want to believe there's a reason behind the outcome, even though there isn't. Here's an analogy. Imagine your brain as a storyteller sitting by a campfire. Life throws random sparks into the night, and the storyteller quickly spins them into tales so that the world feels less overwhelming. Some of those tales are useful. They help you anticipate danger, or they inspire creative leaps. Others are misleading, pulling you into illusions. The skill you need isn't to silence the storyteller, but to become a more discerning editor. You need to ask, does this story help me grow, or is it trapping me in superstition? Let's make this practical. One common way apophenia shows up is in what people call signs. Maybe you're thinking about changing careers and suddenly you see 3 articles about quitting jobs in a row. Or you're wondering if you should reach out to someone and they unexpectedly text you first. It's tempting to interpret these as messages from the universe, But here's the reality. Your brain is primed to notice what you're already thinking about. Psychologists call this selective attention, and it's closely related to the frequency illusion. For example, if you buy a red car, you suddenly notice red cars everywhere. They were always there, but your attention filter changed. When you start seeing signs, it's often your brain highlighting what already matters to you. The danger is that you mistake this spotlight effect for destiny rather than psychology. So how do you avoid falling into that trap? A useful technique is to treat patterns as data points rather than orders. When you notice a coincidence, instead of saying, "This must be a sign telling me what to do," try saying, "This is information about what's on my mind." For example, if you keep noticing content about quitting jobs, maybe it's not fate. It's your own subconscious reminding you that this issue matters deeply. The coincidence becomes a mirror, not a command. This shift prevents you from outsourcing your decisions to randomness while still letting you learn from the signals your brain is amplifying. Another everyday example of apophenia is superstition. Athletes wear lucky socks. Students take the same pen into every exam. Deep down, they know the object has no real power, but it feels comforting. Why? Because the brain prefers the illusion of control over the discomfort of chaos. Even a false pattern can calm anxiety by giving you something to hold on to. And here again, the key is not to mock yourself for believing in silly rituals, but to understand what your brain is trying to achieve. It wants predictability. It wants stability. Knowing this, you can create healthy rituals instead of superstitious ones. For example, instead of lucky socks, you can build a calming pre-performance routine, a breathing exercise, a favorite playlist, or a short stretch. These habits serve the same psychological purpose but are grounded in real benefits. Creativity is where apophenia becomes a superpower. Artists, writers, and scientists thrive on connecting dots that others miss. Think about surrealist painters turning random brushstrokes into dreamscapes, or inventors noticing similarities between nature and machines. This is apophenia in action, but directed toward innovation rather than illusion. You can cultivate this deliberately through exercises like random association. Open a book to a random page, take the first word you see, and try to link it to the problem you're working on. Your brain's pattern-making instinct will immediately start weaving connections, and sometimes the result is surprisingly insightful. Another technique is forced analogy. Ask yourself, how is my challenge like cooking a meal or like navigating a forest? These questions push your mind to generate unexpected connections, and often those lead to fresh perspectives. But let's pause and address an important concern. What about when apophenia gets out of control? For some people, the brain's pattern detection can spiral into harmful territory, paranoia, conspiracy theories, or obsessive thinking. If you've ever found yourself reading too much into a random comment or worrying that coincidences mean something bad, you've experienced a milder version of this. The line between useful pattern making and harmful overinterpretation is not always clear. This is why awareness matters. Simply knowing that your brain is wired to invent stories can give you a critical moment of distance. Instead of immediately believing the pattern, you can ask, is this connection real, useful, or is it just my brain craving order? That question alone can prevent a lot of unnecessary suffering. And this brings us to the practical toolkit, how to use apophenia for creativity without being misled by it. The first tool is awareness. Name the phenomenon when it happens. If you find yourself thinking, this coincidence must mean something, pause and say, this is apophenia at work. Labeling it reduces its power. The second tool is reframing. Treat coincidences as mirrors of your inner state, not as instructions from outside. This way, they become opportunities for reflection instead of traps. The third tool is deliberate use. Create spaces where your brain can freely connect random things. Brainstorming sessions, doodling, free writing. By channeling apophenia into play, you turn it from a source of confusion into a generator of ideas. As you can see, the tendency to see patterns in chaos is not a weakness. It's a feature of being human. Your brain is trying to make sense of a noisy, unpredictable world, and sometimes it overshoots. The challenge is to guide that energy wisely. When you let it run unchecked, you may end up chasing illusions. But when you cultivate awareness and direct it into creativity, you unlock one of the most powerful aspects of the human mind, the ability to find meaning, imagine new possibilities, and tell stories that move you forward. Here's another way to think about it. Apophenia is like a spotlight shining on the vast stage of reality. The spotlight doesn't show you everything. It highlights certain details, sometimes accurately, sometimes randomly. The problem is that your brain tends to assume that whatever is in the spotlight is the whole story. Recognizing this tendency gives you the freedom to step back, to see the bigger picture, and to decide how to interpret what you notice. When you remember that your mind is constantly stitching together fragments into stories, you can learn to separate useful insights from comforting illusions. For instance, if you keep noticing coincidences around relationships, instead of concluding this person is my soulmate, you can recognize that your attention is fixated on the desire for connection, and that's the real data. Once you see it that way, the coincidence becomes less about fate and more about understanding yourself. Now let's dive deeper into how you can actually train your brain to use this mechanism constructively. The first technique is what I call pattern reframing. Whenever you notice a pattern, pause and ask yourself two questions. What story is my brain trying to tell me? And is this story helpful or harmful? If the story inspires you, sparks an idea, or helps you understand yourself better, keep it. If it locks you into fear, superstition, or rigid thinking, gently let it go. This practice builds mental flexibility and prevents you from becoming a prisoner of your own storytelling mind. The second technique is deliberate randomness. Because your brain is so eager to find patterns, you can use randomness as a creative catalyst. Pick two unrelated objects, say a coffee mug and a tree, and force yourself to connect them. At first it feels silly, but soon your brain starts weaving stories. Maybe the mug represents nourishment and the tree represents growth, and suddenly you're thinking about how daily rituals support long-term goals. This is not magic, it's apophenia harnessed intentionally. Writers, artists, and inventors have used similar exercises for centuries. By playing with randomness instead of fearing it, you unlock new pathways of thought. The third technique is mindful coincidence tracking. Instead of treating coincidences as messages from the universe, treat them as journaling prompts. Each time something odd happens, like hearing the same song in different places, write it down and ask, what does this remind me of? What might it reveal about my current state of mind? Over time, you'll notice that the signs you encounter often reflect what you're already processing internally. The act of tracking them transforms them from confusing mysteries into tools for reflection. You can also learn from philosophy here. Carl Jung famously talked about synchronicity, the idea that meaningful coincidences might reveal hidden connections between the inner and outer world. While Jung leaned toward the mystical, you don't have to. You can reinterpret synchronicity as psychology. When the external world mirrors your internal state, it feels meaningful because it is meaningful to you. This doesn't mean the universe is sending coded instructions. It means your brain is showing you what matters most right now. That realization can be liberating. You don't need to chase signs, you need to pay attention to yourself. And let's not forget the darker side, conspiracy thinking. Conspiracies thrive on apophenia. When someone strings together unrelated facts into a grand narrative, it satisfies the brain's craving for coherence. It feels good to connect the dots, even if the dots don't belong together. If you want to protect yourself from falling into this trap, practice the habit of asking, what would I see if I didn't connect these things? Could they simply be unrelated? It's a small question, but it pulls you back from the brink of false certainty. Being able to tolerate randomness is a form of psychological strength. Not every coincidence needs a story. Sometimes things just happen, and being okay with that is just as important as finding meaning when it's truly there. Another layer of this phenomenon is how it shapes your identity. Think about the stories you tell yourself about who you are. I always attract the wrong partners. I'm lucky with money. Bad things happen in threes. These are narratives built on selective attention, fueled by apophenia. You notice the moments that confirm the story and ignore the ones that contradict it. This is not a moral failing, it's how the brain works. But once you realize it, you can start editing your identity story. Instead of saying, I always attract the wrong partners, you might reframe it as, my brain is connecting a few bad experiences into a larger story, but that doesn't define me. By challenging these automatic stories, you reclaim authorship of your life. Let's turn this into a small exercise. Think of a coincidence you recently experienced, something that felt like a sign. Write it down. Then write two possible interpretations, one superstitious, one constructive. For example, if you kept seeing ads for travel when you were feeling stuck at work, the superstitious interpretation might be, the universe wants me to quit my job. The constructive interpretation might be, I'm craving change and adventure, and my brain is highlighting anything that reminds me of that. Notice how the second interpretation gives you agency instead of outsourcing it to fate. By practicing this reframing, You develop the ability to use coincidences as mirrors for self-discovery instead of traps of magical thinking. What's fascinating is that apophenia doesn't just live in individuals, it shapes entire cultures. Religions, myths, and rituals often emerge from humans collectively seeing patterns in nature, stars forming constellations, seasons tied to harvests, eclipses interpreted as omens. While modern science explains these phenomena differently, the underlying human need remains the same: to find order in chaos. Understanding apophenia helps you appreciate how deeply this instinct runs through history, while also giving you the tools to decide how you want to use it in your personal life. You're not just a passive recipient of your brain's stories. You can choose to engage with them creatively, critically, and intentionally. Now let's connect all of this to everyday life. Next time you catch yourself thinking, "This must be a sign," pause and ask, "Is this my brain's pattern machine at work? And if so, what does this reveal about me right now?" By turning the spotlight inward, you gain clarity about your desires, fears, and priorities. Then you can decide, do I want to act on this coincidence or simply acknowledge it and move on? Either way, you're reclaiming control. You're no longer letting random events dictate your decisions. You're using them as stepping stones for awareness and growth. And remember, the goal is not to suppress apophenia or shame yourself for it. This mechanism is part of what makes you human. It gave our ancestors an edge, it fuels our creativity, and it colors our experience of the world with meaning. The key is to stay awake to how it works. When you understand that your brain is a storyteller looking for patterns, you gain the freedom to decide which stories to believe, which ones to let go, and which ones to transform into art, insight, or action. So the next time you see a coincidence, instead of asking, "What does this mean for my fate?" try asking, "What story is my brain telling me, and how can I use it to understand myself better?" That simple shift can turn the chaos of randomness into a source of creativity, resilience, and wisdom. And if this perspective opened something for you today, share it with someone who also tends to search for signs and invite them into this conversation. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us here at Mind Unlocked, your toolkit for better thinking, for deeper self-understanding, and for building a life that feels not only coherent but truly alive.